This is Kat Klingesmith with Retro Crime. We all know Bonnie and Clyde, the world's most famous outlaws whose relationship was romanticized. Right before they were public enemies, there was another outlaw couple, Irene Schroeder and Glenn Daig. They were executed in 1931, and Irene was the first woman to be executed by electric chair in Pennsylvania. Irene Schroeder was originally Irene Crawford and born in 1909 in Benwood, West Virginia. It's on the Panhandle and also where Charles Manson grew up. When his schoolmates found out what became of him, they said, "Yeah, that sounds about right." Irene's dad was a fish supplier and her mom had 15 children, but only 12 survived their childhoods. That's actually more than could be expected because at the time, only 60 to 70% of children survived childhood in rural Appalachia. Irene was the youngest. Her mom was 46 when she had her, so I'm skeptical. She came 4 years after the last child, and it wasn't unheard of for grandparents to cover for a grandchild born out of wedlock. Irene's mother died when Irene was only 8 years old, so she lived with older siblings until she married at 15 to 19-year-old Homer Schrader. She then became Irene Schrader, not Schroeder yet, just Schrader. The following year, she had baby Donnie, and her marriage fell apart. Homer moved to California, and Irene moved to Wheeling, West Virginia, and supported herself and little Donnie by working as a waitress. In August of 1927, when she was 18 years old and on her way to work, she was nearly hit by a car while crossing the street. Driving it was 31-year-old Glenn Daig. He made sure she was okay, and they chatted a bit. He became her regular customer, and their affection grew and became mutual until one day he didn't return home to his lovely wife and two children, who lived only 16 miles away. Glenn Daig, he was working as a car salesman. He had taught Sunday school also and led his son's Boy Scout troop. Glenn promised to provide for Irene and her son, and when the car salesman job didn't work out, he sold washing machines and pantyhose, dug ditches, and found various day labor. The last officially honest job he had was as an arborist assistant. At work, he fell off a tall ladder and was too injured to return to work. They needed money, so Irene was ready to turn to prostitution. Glenn would not allow that. He told her that if he couldn't make money honestly, then he would get it another way. They sold their clothes, and he bought revolvers from a pawn shop in downtown Pittsburgh. With that, their crime spree had officially begun. With little Donnie in the back seat, they would go to stores and ask whoever was working there to get them something large, like a sack of flour or a bag of apples. When the clerk picked it up and turned around, they found guns pointing at them and were walked into the back where Glenn tied them up while Irene stole what was in the register. While they hadn't needed to resort to violence, they practiced shooting targets, and Irene was an exceptional marksman. To throw the police off their scent, Irene changed her name from Schrader to Schroeder. I'm surprised she didn't double down and change her first name to Irina. They traveled all over, and Donnie would lay down in the back seat and wait. Despite Irene traumatizing people by robbing them at gunpoint, she was a loving partner and good mother. Donnie was very well taken care of. Most of Irene's family was law-abiding, but the three youngest, Edward, Thomas, and Irene, they were all criminals. It makes sense. Their mother had been worn out and grieving the loss of three small children back to back. The remaining youngest three weren't getting the attention they needed. Their mother worked hard as a housekeeper, then died of heart failure while the kids were still living at home. Also, when a woman's body doesn't have time to recover from back-to-back pregnancies, down the line we start seeing developmental difficulties in the youngest children, both physical and mental, because mental is also physical. Irene's brother Tom joined them on their adventures, and that's when they ran into some bad luck. After robbing a store in Butler, Pennsylvania, their car was reported by a witness. An officer hopped on his motorcycle, and his partner got in the sidecar, which actually sounds like a lot of fun. I would love to ride in a sidecar. They blocked the path, and when Irene, Glenn, Tom, and Donnie arrived, the officers raised their guns and told them to get out of the car. 4-year-old Donnie said that he was afraid that the policemen were going to shoot Papa, which is what he called Glenn. Irene got out of the car, pointed her gun at one of the police officers, and told him to back off. The officer slowly raised his hands, then yelled at the other officer to shoot. Irene immediately shot him in the chest 3 times, while Tom, still in the back seat, shot the other officer. The one Irene shot died, and the one Tom shot lived but had his nose blown off. This was the first time any of them had either shot or killed anyone. They had been able to get by until then without any physical violence. It's worth noting that Irene's brother Edward had just been shot in the back by police while unarmed. After Irene killed the officer, they drove off until they could find someone to carjack. They left their old car behind and should have done a better job cleaning it because there was a receipt in it for a clothing shop in Wheeling that Irene frequented. Through the receipt, law enforcement was able to track down Irene's father, John, and Donnie was with him. John gave an alibi for Donnie and said that Donnie was with him the whole time, therefore, the group did not match the description of three grown-ups and a child. Then Donnie opened his big mouth and said, "My mom shot two policemen, just like you." Irene and Glenn had dropped Donnie off at her father's during a snowstorm. They were able to get a great head start. One of the advantages gangsters had in the 1930s was that there were now paved roads, especially between major cities, and easy access to automobiles. Law enforcement communication hadn't advanced as quickly as the civil engineering. Irene and Glenn were able to get as far as Arizona. Then they finally hit an obstacle they weren't prepared for: the desert. Before I went to Arizona for the first time, I was warned not to make a wrong turn because I would end up driving into nothingness. That's exactly what happened to them. They didn't know where else to go, so they got out and crossed a river to find some kind of shelter to hide in. To the local tribe, it wasn't nothingness, it was their home. The tribal deputies found them quickly. A posse had gathered, and there was a good old-fashioned gangster shootout. Despite Irene having shot the buttons off a police officer's coat recently along their escape route, she was no match for the cowboys who had assembled. The cowboys dodged every bullet until Irene and Glenn were out of them and had to surrender. At the police station, Irene and Glenn gave them fake names and refused to budge on the matter. Someone had the idea to put Donnie on the phone, but Irene said that she didn't know who he was and wouldn't take the call. Another person said that he just got word that Donnie broke his leg at the juvenile facility he was at, and Irene didn't even know he was at one and wouldn't believe that he blabbed. I guess being the youngest, she didn't have any little siblings to show her what big mouths they all have. Eventually, Irene learned that, indeed, Donnie had told on them, so she gave her name and told Glenn to tell them everything. She thought that if they knew that she was the trigger woman, Glenn would get a lighter sentence. She was wrong. At the trial, we learned a lot about Irene. We also learned, through the press, that all the women in her family were short and heavyset. The press really liked pointing that out. Her appearance was described as 5'2", 160 pounds, sporting a bleached blonde bob haircut, and homely. I've seen pictures, and she was a stone-cold fox. I kid you not. I don't know what their standards were, but they were not objectively human ones. We also learned about Irene's inner workings. She tried to commit suicide 4 times in her life, when she was 8, 15, 16, and recently. Those are the years her mom died, she got married, she got pregnant, and got arrested for murder. She started developing kleptomania at 9, soon after her mom died, and described it as growing into a compulsion. A year later, around 10, she took a bad fall and injured her head. It made her nearsighted and gave her chronic headaches the rest of her life. Her attorney wondered if it was the cause of her antisocial behavior, and I wish they had looked into that further and had information that we had now, because what we have learned about traumatic brain injuries is that, yes, it definitely could have contributed, and the chronic headaches and myopia are clear symptoms that she indeed had a traumatic brain injury. Frontal lobe injuries affect the part of the brain that regulates emotions and impulses. In court, Irene said that she didn't feel like stealing was wrong, and she didn't know why she didn't feel like it was wrong. As far as killing the police officer, she didn't feel like it was wrong because she was protecting her family. When asked if she thought murder was wrong, she said she didn't know, that she hadn't thought about it before. To a jury in 1930, she sounded like a bad seed. But now She sounds like a person answering honestly about how permanent brain trauma affects their perception. Glenn's trial was mostly asking him about what guns they used. People having personal contact with Irene during this time really liked her. At both the Lawrence County Jail and Rockview Penitentiary in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, everyone only had positive things to say about her, like that she was gracious and well mannered. Both she and Glenn were kind and expressed appreciation for how well they were being treated while in custody. Meanwhile, Glenn was still married with kids. His wife and children visited him often, and reporters pointed out how slim and pretty his wife is, as though that made her superior to Irene in some way. The press was also brutal about pushing the narrative that Glenn had been a respectable man until Irene came along and brought him down. When Donnie visited them, he split his time between his mom and Glenn. He referred to Glenn still as Papa. Irene's siblings and father visited her, except for Tom. Tom was nowhere to be found. After shooting the nose off of the police officer, he disappeared. His hip had been grazed by a bullet during the shootout, and Donnie said he had been bleeding in the car. Glenn confessed to his wife privately that Tom had died from the gunshot wound, and they threw his body into a river near Brownsville, Texas. Both Irene and Glenn were sentenced to death. They appealed, and countless people across the country begged for mercy from the courts because Irene was a mother. One of the members of the jury wrote a letter to the governor begging him to change Irene's sentence. He had changed his mind and couldn't, in good conscience, send her to the electric chair. The governor would not budge. Within a week of her turning 22, on the day of February 23rd, 1931, Irene Schroeder became the first woman in Pennsylvania sent to the electric chair. She asked to go first, and those who witnessed it were in awe of how she lived up to her nickname, Iron Irene. As Irene and Glenn walked from their cells to the chair, the death row inmates sang Christian hymns, and Irene, Glenn, and the staff joined in. The warden's wife walked Irene to the chair, and the nurse in the room, in all white, sobbed. Iron Irene didn't shed a tear. She said she was at peace, and knowing that gave her family great comfort. Irene's oldest brother, John, was at the execution and relayed the news to the family and the press. Glenn's only support at his execution was Reverend Teagarden, who had been the minister at the church Glenn had once taught Sunday school. After the execution, the mother of the 25-year-old officer Irene had killed said publicly that Irene and Glenn can rest easily in their graves because she bears no vengeance in her heart for them. Glenn was buried with his family, and his grave faced away from his mother and his sister in shame, but later someone etched his information onto the other side of the gravestone. Irene was buried with her family as well, and Tom joined her 2 years later, after he was shot to death by the police after committing a burglary in Missouri. It turns out Glenn had lied to his wife to keep the authorities from searching for Tom Crawford. As for Donnie, he moved around relatives, then went into the military. He made a career for himself in the Air Force. He settled down with a wife and children and used the military to pay for college. He became an engineer for NASA. I think there's more to the Irene and Glenn story. Glenn's wife has said that Glenn was a model husband and father until he met Irene. Irene was made out to be a young vamp who seduced older married men. Common sense tells us that this scenario is bullshit. Digging deeper into Glenn, a lot was left out about him. He couldn't hold a job. On his enlistment papers in his early 20s, he had been a teacher. By the time he met Irene in his early 30s, he had been through several jobs. It was the Depression and opportunity was limited, granted, but his luck with jobs was especially bad, considering that he lived outside of a big city. His wife was then working as a teacher instead, while he went from day laborer, insurance salesman, chauffeur, and various other jobs before he met Irene as a car salesman. The sleazy car salesman trope comes from this time because car sales plummeted after the stock market crash, and owners of car dealerships were desperate to sell their inventory to stay in business. Some resorted to unethical sales practices. These are jobs that one doesn't necessarily need good references for. Irene, on the other hand, had had steady work and supported her family as a single mother. Her criminal record was clean. It wasn't until she met Glenn that this changed. What causes people to be unable to keep a job while they desperately need a job? What causes people to be desperate enough to need money on a whim so robbery is more convenient than waiting for a paycheck? What causes a wife to pretend that her husband was perfect until he met a bad girl when clearly he was up to no good? He was a much older family man who sought out a young, single 18-year-old mother. He was visiting her diner and spending money feeding himself instead of taking care of his family 16 miles away. The only way their story makes sense to me is if Glenn Daig was a heroin addict. If not heroin, then morphine. Wheeling at the time was run by mobsters and vice, and heroin had already been introduced to the big cities. I think when Irene started hanging out with Glenn, she picked up the habit too. They were from completely different worlds, and what brings two strangers together better than an addiction, right? In researching them, I found hints at this that were largely ignored. One of them being that there had been a drug charge against Irene that didn't stick. Then in 1930, Irene's sister said publicly that, and this is a quote, if they had not used dope, they would never have pulled those jobs. This was the same sister who took Irene in after her mom had passed away, and Donnie was staying with her until he was transferred to a juvenile facility before testifying in court. Glenn's wife sounds like a classic enabler and denied any of his shortcomings. She blamed Irene, the other woman. But Glenn was the one who decided to rob people at gunpoint. He was the one who purchased the guns, and he was the one who pursued a teenage mother. He also didn't kill anyone and was sentenced to death anyway. They probably didn't deserve the death penalty, but they couldn't have been trusted to be released. Without appropriate treatment for drug addiction, not to mention their addiction to each other, it was only a matter of time before more people who crossed their paths died. Donnie did the world a favor by innocently snitching on them. Iron Irene didn't deserve death, but she did deserve peace, and that's what she got.